All right, class. For now, we're going to talk about thesis statements. These are going to be, this is going to be probably the most important sentence in your essay. It lets me, the reader, know what the entire point you're trying to make is. So if you're writing an argument paper, it lets me know your position and what you're arguing for. If you're writing an analysis evaluation paper, it lets me know what it is you're analyzing and your some brief thoughts on that thing. If you're writing a narrative, it lets me know what story you're going to tell. If you're writing a compare contrast paper, it lets me know what's being compared and contrasted. So it's a really good guiding light for your reader that gives them the main point. It's also a great tool for you as the writer because it lets you know what does and doesn't belong in your essay. If you write a bunch of paragraphs and you can't link them back to your thesis statement in some way, then there's a good chance that that stuff doesn't belong in your essay. Not 100%. Those are decisions you have to make as the composer of the essay, but there's a good to fair chance. So let me get on to this real quick. Some basic stuff. It gives your reader the main idea or point of your essay, and also it's going to be unique to both the genre of essay writing and topic you have. There is no one-size-all-fits formula. Some of you may be familiar with the three-point thesis statement from the classic five-paragraph essay that was being taught in high school when I was a student, and I'm told is still taught in high school quite often, where your thesis statement's going to have three different points in it, and each one of those points is going to relate to one of your body paragraphs in your essay. That is sort of like thesis statement training wheels. It doesn't really work anymore at the level at which we're writing. So for example, your first essay is kind of short. It might end up being only 5 paragraphs long, I don't know, but you should really refocus it onto just the story you're telling and not try and cram in 3 main points. When essays get longer, what do you do when an essay is, 8 pages long and it's a dozen paragraphs? Well, you can't cram a dozen points, one for every body paragraph, into your thesis statement without it looking like this big, horrible thing. So you got to figure out what your main point is and just communicate that to your reader. And this is typically the last sentence of your introduction. So that's academic convention. That's just what readers of essays expect, is that the last sentence of your introduction is going to be your thesis statement. Later on, when, if you end up writing papers that get significantly longer, 20, 30 pages, or like extensive lab reports, if you're going into the sciences or something like that, you may have an entire introductory section. Your main point might be communicated in multiple sentences. But for the level we're at in undergraduate writing, your introduction's typically going to be a single paragraph, and it's going to end in your thesis statement, which is typically going to be a single sentence. So until your papers get so long that you need to expand things to communicate the ideas you're talking about, that's probably what you're going to be working with through the bulk of getting your undergraduate degree. So think about what you are trying to do in your assignment, refer to your assignment sheet, and give the reader your main point for that. Now for you guys, you're writing a literacy narrative where you're telling me about something you're an expert in and a story related to that in some way. And so your thesis statement should do two things. It should tell me the thing you're an expert in, whatever that happens to be, and the specific story you're going to tell related to that thing you're an expert in. So let's look at a couple examples. Okay, so here are some example thesis statements. I'm going to start with this first one here. All in all, my first Crohn's flare-up was an eye-opening experience. So that tells my reader that I'm going to be talking about Crohn's disease, and that the specific story I'm telling is going to be about my first Crohn's flare-up. And that's all your thesis statement has to be for an essay like this. It's, I'm trying to communicate about a topic I'm an expert in, and I'm going to tell a particular story about that topic and my involvement. All right, well, if those are the two things you're trying to do, then those are the two things that need to go into the thesis statement for this particular paper. And so something like this, clear to the point, it lets my reader know exactly what I'm talking about. If I imagine that I read this at the end of an introduction, all in all, my first Crohn's flare-up was an eye-opening experience, that tells me, the reader, the rest of this essay is going to be about this first Crohn's disease flare-up and how this person's a Crohn's disease patient. Anything else in that, if I'm the writer and I accidentally write something in this essay that I can't relate back to this story, then that probably deserves to be cut from the essay. But as a reader, I would expect that all the following paragraphs will be in some way about this. They'll either be giving me background information on what Crohn's disease, so I understand what it is, on what Crohn's disease is, so I understand what it is, or they're going to be about the particular things that happened during that time. Similarly, with the second thesis statement down here, dealing with the problem player at the table really showed me how important the social aspect of Dungeons and Dragons is, especially since I was the dungeon master. This tells my reader that I'm going to be talking about being a Dungeons and Dragons player, even more specifically, a particular kind of Dungeons and Dragons player, the dungeon master, and the specific story I'm talking about, a time I had to deal with the problem player. So this does everything it needs to do. It could probably be a little shorter even. Boom. So with a little editing, we've got dealing with a problem player showed me how important the social aspect of Dungeons & Dragons is. That's it. That's all this really needs to be. Tells my reader I'm talking about being a Dungeons & Dragons player. Tells my reader I'm talking about a time I had to deal with a problem player. Those two things. That's all I'm really looking for. Now, this last one, growing up, I never really thought about my race, but one experience I had while serving on the Maxwell Honor Guard really made me open my eyes to the experiences of others not like me. Now, this is not a good thesis statement, really, so it's not actually very specific. Clearly, if the author of this thesis statement is talking about their race, and they're talking about one experience they had while serving on the Maxwell Honor Guard. Now, if you didn't see me, if you had never seen or heard me or anything like that, me saying my race doesn't really tell you what I mean by that or what that is. Or me saying one experience I had doesn't tell you if that was a good experience or a bad experience. It was in Alabama, so it was a negative experience. The specific thing that happened is I was with the rest of my team. We were traveling up to North Alabama to do the funeral services for a veteran, and we stopped at a gas station to get directions, and our captain goes in there, and he's in full service dress. He's all shiny, military, completely formal, perfect uniform. And the guy at the gas station wouldn't give us directions to the church because it was a black church. So it's like, oh, people like that actually do exist. Because I'm not from Alabama. I'm from Southern California mostly. It's a very different culture out there. So in fact, this is true, but this thesis statement doesn't tell my reader what I mean by one experience. It doesn't even tell my reader what I mean by race. Things like these that are more specific, that's what we're looking for. But I should be able to read your thesis statement in isolation and not be like, oh, what do you mean by that? One experience, what do you mean by that? It's a very little green ball statement. It doesn't actually tell my reader what it needs to. So these first two are good examples. This third one's not really great because it lacks specificity. So your thesis statement should be specific. Now, it might well be the case that the previous sentences of the introduction tell the reader what I mean by my race. They would tell the reader that I'm white. I think it's good practice, especially this early on in your college writing careers, to try and craft a thesis statement that stands on its own. In general, yeah, it would be fine because this context might be in the rest of the introduction. But if I'm writing really strong thesis statements that can stand on their own, I don't then have to also go back and look at my introduction to make sure that it's doing what it needs to do by delivering that extra context. I could just roll up and be like, here's my thesis statement. It's everything I need to know. So again, it's one of the first sentences I'm going to read in your essay when I'm grading it, because it will tell me what the rest of the essay is supposed to be about, and that will tell me whether or not all the paragraphs I see in there belong in there or not. So it might well be the case that if you're writing along, you're drafting your essay and you say something in a paragraph and you go, oh, now that I've said this, I should explain it in another paragraph, or I want to elaborate on this, so I'm going to have another paragraph where I describe this. That's all well and good, but you can double check to make sure that the stuff you've added relates to your thesis statement in some way. Also, if you can get your thesis statement nailed down, as you're doing your outline, then that'll let you know, even before you get to drafting, whether or not there's some information that in your outline, if you can't relate it back to your thesis statement, maybe cut it from the outline before you actually spend the time to like write up those paragraphs. Now, I will also note, as yet a side tangent to the side tangent, that as you're drafting along and writing, it'll often be the case that you say something and you go, oh, I should add a paragraph about this in, or oh, I need to add details about this in. That's totally normal and fine. And that's probably actually going to be the case. Like the outline is a good plan, but it has to be flexible because chances are it'll change during the actual drafting process as you type some sentences up and realize you need to go into more detail about something. Just make sure that the other stuff you add, check it in revision to make sure it relates back to your thesis statement and does in fact belong in the essay. Sometimes the stuff I end up adding in like that absolutely needed to be in the essay. I just didn't catch it during pre-writing. And sometimes I've gone off on a tangent and that stuff needs to be cut. But in determining whether or not something belongs in your essay, your thesis statement is a beautiful little lighthouse for you that can guide all the relevant information into the essay itself, and you can cut out the rest of it. So again, it's the last sentence of your introduction. It should be a single statement that tells me the entire point of your essay, and in the case of your narrative, that the two things it should have are, it should tell me what the story you're telling me is and what the thing you're an expert in is. And that's all I'm in particular looking for. So the next video will be about introductions and conclusions more specifically, and then we will move on from there. I will see you in the next video.